Okay. Well, we are really lucky today to be joined by Patricia Walsh Chadwick. Patricia, thank you very much for joining us. I
Thank you
wanted
for
to give
having
every
me.
Oh, well, thank you for joining us again. You are extremely busy. We are very again, we're really lucky that you're taking some time out of your busy day to join us here today. So thank you. We very much appreciate your time. I'm going to give a little bit of background on Patricia before we get started here. Patricia has a very unique and interesting background, which is why we had reached out to her to begin with, because we again very lucky to have a chat here. Patricia grew up in a religious community, and it turned into a cult in the Boston area, which we're going to discuss. She was kicked out of the cult at a very young age, and she ultimately went on to get her BA in economics from Boston University and had a 30-year career in investment management, in the investment management business, culminating as a global partner in Invesco. Today, she sits on a number of corporate boards and blogs and discusses on a number of issues, social, economical, political, sort of all over the spectrum. Patricia is also a two-time author. The first book she wrote was entitled Little Sister, and that was about her time growing up in the cult. And her second book is entitled Breaking Glass, and it's Tales from the Witch of Wall Street. I have read both of these books, and I would highly recommend both of them. The first one, again, is very interesting in terms of learning about Patricia's background, growing up in the religious community. And after you finish reading it, you think to yourself, "Man, how did she go from growing up in a cult to becoming a global partner at Invesco?" Well, that's the second book to talking about her 30 plus career in investment management. So they're kind of sequels. I don't think you can read one without the other. And again, I've read both and I would highly recommend both of them. They're both terrific books. What makes Patricia's story so unique, again, is part of this is that she grew up in a cult, but that's really just part of the story. It's her rise up the corporate ladder. She was kicked out of the cult at a very young age and basically started with next to nothing. Her family remained in the cult, and you can imagine how difficult that would be to leave the cult with next to nothing at a very young age as a teenager. And she really had to find her way in the world almost by herself. And she started her investment career as a receptionist, and really the rest is history. She rose up from being a receptionist and worked her way all the way up the corporate ladder to the highest levels in Wall Street. And again, you got to remember this was also at a time when it was a male dominated Wall Street. So again, we're talking about the 70s, 80s, and 90s type time frame. It was a completely different environment than what it is today. And to do all of that, basically starting with next to nothing it's an absolutely incredible story. However, Patricia, the first thing I just wanted to start with again is the title of your book, the Witch of Wall Street, because I actually did some Googling on the original Witch of Wall Street. And I believe the original Witch of Wall Street was also an investment guru named Hetty Green. I believe Hetty Green wore black on a regular basis. That was, I'm sure, partially what contributed to her being referred to as the Witch of Wall Street. But she was also extremely thrifty and referred to as the world's greatest miser, which I didn't realize was actually a quality of witches, which I'm not sure is a quality or not. Now, the thing is, after reading your book, I don't think any of these apply to you. Again, I looked up Hetty's investment strategy, which I loved. She said, I buy things, I buy when things are low and nobody wants them. I keep them until they go up and people go crazy for them, which again, if there's one, form of investing that has stood the test of time, I'm sure it's that one. But Patricia, maybe just as a start, how did you come up with the title of your second book?
I came up with the title of the second book because on my 70th birthday, which is now 6 years ago, some friends of mine from Wall Street threw a party for me. And over the course of the evening, one woman got up to tell the audience how we met. And she was an institutional salesperson at Bear Stearns.
Okay.
And she had been called into the office of the head of institutional sales. And he said to her, Citicorp, this is when I was at Citicorp at the time, it was 1985. Citicorp is a very big account for us. And there's a woman there who runs a lot of the money. But I have a problem. I've put more salesmen on the account and they're all afraid of her. And this woman, who was about 10 years younger than I was telling the audience, I'd never met her, but I'd heard her name. And whenever I was in the trading room, the guys on the desk referred to her as the Witch of Wall Street.
I see.
And I was so shocked. Only 6 years ago, I found out about this before I had started writing this book. And I was dismayed actually. And it was my birthday and I wanted to be happy and jovial and everybody else was laughing. And I'm thinking, this is a disgrace. How did this ever happen? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that very likely it was the characteristics that I displayed, which in a man could often make him the wolf of Wall Street or considered leadership. But when exhibited by a woman, she gets called the Witch of Wall Street, or maybe there was a B instead of a W. I don't know. But I decided, after thinking it through for a long time, I decided to embrace it and to enjoy it. And so now I smile when I talk about it. And that's the only reason it's there. If I hadn't had my 70th birthday, I might never have known that that's what I was called.
And did you ever go back? Because the other thing that's really interesting in your book is you talk a lot about your mentors, and you had several
Yes.
mentors throughout the course. Did you ever go back to any of them and said, the Witch of Wall Street, like, is this something that I should have known, 30 years ago type of thing? Or did you ever get any perspective from some of the mentors that you work with along the way?
Well, my mentors, for the most part, have left this earth
I see.
by the time I was writing this book. But I did go back to other people on Wall Street with whom I was associated and worked very closely with. And, the responses were never. Now, maybe never's a strong word, but they said, wait, you were tough and you were demanding. And so somebody else might call you that, but I worked very, very well with people. It was a man's world. I felt very comfortable in that world. And so I think if, one person's interpretation that got a hold and became part of the lore. But I don't think any of my mentors would ever have said that about me. Actually, one of them is very much alive. And he was shocked. He
Yeah.
was shocked. He's well into his 80s now, but he was shocked. And it's perhaps the person they don't know when they speak about someone. And yet there were people in my own office, as you read about in my book, who didn't like me. It was mostly on the male side. But, celebrity, you can't please everyone all the time.
I think it's what you alluded to earlier, Patricia. I think that you were a lone wolf, right? There was only a few women who were as senior as you. If a male acted like that, it was kind of, par for the course, and
Yes.
was given a certain reputation. But if a woman were to act like that, or even in some circumstances, it's a totally different thing. And it's probably just because, again, like you say, there wasn't a lot of women. All of you look at your mentors. I
They were
think there
all
was only
men,
one.
yes.
There was only one woman that was listed as a mentor, and that goes back to your time at the in the cult, right? As one of the women who you really looked up to, which was it's interesting, yeah.
I also read 3 biographies of Hetty Green. I
Oh,
really want
really? Oh,
to,
wow.
they sit on my shelf up here. And it was fascinating. She also came from Massachusetts. She also came to New York when she was 26 years old. So
Wow.
I found that kind of just coincidental and fascinating. But she did become more and more miserly the more money she got. But one of her big competitors was JP Morgan.
Oh, really?
And yes, and she was making loans to railroads that were, expanding. And she was a powerhouse. She
Yeah.
was a powerhouse.
Yeah, well, the stories that just reading on the internet about her and about her, the way she spend her money, you have to respect some of that, in terms of not being wasteful, and
Absolutely.
there's certainly something to be said for, and her investment strategy, some things are just are beautiful in their simplicity. How simple is that? Again, one aspect of an investment strategy that has probably lasted 100 plus years and
And you know
continues to
what?
be
That's
true
what
today.
Warren Buffett says.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. No, I'm glad, you came up with the title of the book, Patricia, because I'm glad I actually dug in and learned a little bit about Hetty Green.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So maybe just talk a little bit about, again, what makes your story. There's a lot of elements that make your story very unique, but certainly one of the aspects which makes your story unique is the environment in which you grew up in. And I think a lot of the people involved, a lot of people listening to this would hear the word cult or hear the word religious community and not really know what it means. You think about cult, and again, your mind might go into a million different places. You think about religious community, it might go into a different spot. Maybe
Uh,
just talk a little bit about the environment you grew up in and how do you see that difference between a religious community and a cult? And because you make the point of saying it changed at one point from a religious community
Correct.
into a cult. Maybe
Correct.
just talk a little bit about that in the time you spent growing up.
I think there are many religious communities around the country. And of course, a convent of nuns is a religious community, and a monastery is a religious community. So various forms. The thing that I lived through and observed was the metamorphosis from what was a religious community in which there were 12 married couples raising 39 children, and there were other single men and women. What drew the religious community together was their interpretation of a dogma of the Catholic Church, which said that in order to be saved, you had to be Catholic. Now, we know that many religions claim that in order to be saved, you have to belong to that religion. And they were adamant about it. And my father and my mother both believed it. My mother had just converted to Catholicism at the age of 18. She had been Episcopalian all her life. And you read the little story in Little Sister about how she knew from the time she was 6 years old that she wanted to be Catholic. Well, if you become Catholic, of course, you must believe that Catholicism is the way to heaven. My father fought the entire war as a naval officer on the USS Enterprise. And I've sometimes wondered if what he'd seen, he kept a diary and there were days in it that he wrote, I cannot even describe what I saw today. And I had a feeling maybe, and a lot of the men at the center, as we called it, were veterans. And many of them were highly educated and highly intellectual. And there may have been a certain notion of you could call it PTSD, but having seen the dark side of life that maybe drew them to God. And as Catholics, they felt very strongly about being Catholic. There were a number of converts from various religions into Catholicism at the center. And I thought that was fine. I remember being a tiny child. I was the oldest of 5 children. And I remember family life. And I adored it. And I had all these uncles and aunts, these grown-ups who would take me down to the Charles River and pick daisies with me. And I would go to lectures and hear all the grown-ups saying all these things and learning. And to me, it was glorious. And then one day, when I was 6 years old, all came to an end. And all the children that were 3 and older, so in my family of 5, 3 of us were 3 and older. I was already 6, were separated and put into one of the houses that we had. We had a cluster of about 8 houses, and one of the houses and raised separately from our parents. Years later, and I talked to my parents about it, they said they were simply told one day that that was going to happen. And they cornered everybody and just told them individually. And we had taken, and this to me, the clue of a cult, we had taken a vow to obey Father Feeney and whomever he put in charge. That meant they could not say no. And to me, that became the very seed of the cult. Because after that, they forced parents to take vows of celibacy. Then they prevented children from talking to their parents. And then boys and girls couldn't talk to each other. And all based on that vow of obedience that they took. And to me, they were manipulated into the decisions that were really forced on them. Of course, you can say they made them because they chose to stay. And years later, when I talked to my parents about it, my mother said the worst day of her entire life was the day that her children were taken away from her.
Yeah.
And I said, did you think if you didn't do it, they would ask you to leave? Her? Yes, I knew that would happen. And they wanted to stay. So that to me is, then there are many, many other indications of the cult, particularly as, particularly as we got older and we moved from Cambridge out into Still River. And then we became truly monastic, truly
Yeah.
monastic. And at that point, we're told as children that our mission in life, our vocation had been from the moment we were born to stay in this religious community and become religious for life, which as a little 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 year old, all I imagined was sitting in a beautiful garden and having the fairy prince come down and, take me off and bring me to his castle where I would live happily ever after. So it was a very, very manipulative environment. And it has taken me many years to fully appreciate that. You'll notice in Little Sister, I never use the word cult. And in Breaking Glass, I use it many times.
And the other thing that I was thinking to myself as I read, especially the first book, is what were the motivations of the leaders? Like why did they choose to do what they did in terms of have this group where they were, like you say, manipulating them into splitting them up with their parents and splitting apart, brothers and sisters and all this sort of stuff. Was their motivations purely religious in terms of, this is what they believe to be right? Or was their motivation simply that they were controlling people and they had a group of people that they control and it was just all about that. And the religion would just kind of fit into the equation as a way to get what they ultimately wanted. Like what was the motivation of the folk that, there was the two folks that kind of ran it.
Correct.
What do you think their motivation was, Patricia?
I do believe their motivation was very, very much the dogma of the Catholic faith
I see.
that said you had to be Catholic to be saved. And as we were being brought up, we were basically told the entire rest of the world was going to hell. And I used to think about the fact that my father's family were all Catholic. And I thought, why? They're Catholic. But
Yeah.
they were called pious frauds. They had all kinds of names for them because most Catholics did not, and certainly today do not, and even the Pope is very collaborative on the notion that there are many ways to serve God, and you do not always have to be in the same religion.
And what you touched on a little bit, what are some of the kind of the key rules of the cult that would really surprise people who wouldn't grow up? Like you talked about when it switched from a religious community to a cult in your mind, splitting apart the parents from the kids, which is pretty dramatic. I can imagine, certainly understand your mother's perspective on that. I'm sure a lot of parents would feel the exact same way. Is there any other key rules? Because again, it's really interesting in your book learning about, the day to day. Is what would be some of the key, one or two of the other key rules that would really surprise people as to, the environment you grew up in?
Well, there was the complete separation of people. There was also a rule that said no particular friendships. So that we could never have a buddy system. If we were all going off on a hike, there was no buddy system because Sister Catherine did not want anyone to build a particular relationship. We were not supposed to think of our parents in a particular way as parents. But I will tell you, and there were many children in the organization who told me years later, I didn't know if my parents loved me. That was not a problem with the Waltzes. My father, as I've just showed in the book, my father broke the rules time and time again. And we didn't celebrate birthdays. We only celebrated feast days. But each of us on our own birthdays, his was July 24th, mine was August 16th, we would find each other. And he would just whisper to me, "Happy birthday, my little princess." And he had 4 daughters and 1 son. All 4 daughters were called my little princess. And for me, that was the glue that held me together. To
Yeah.
know, I mean, I was always nervous because when he broke the rule, I was afraid Sister Catherine would kick him out. And then I wouldn't even have him around to see,
Yeah.
never realizing that there was no way legally she could do that. So for me, I got very nervous when he would break the rules, but it made me so immensely happy. From the time I was 8 or 9, I knew in my soul that my parents did not want to be living that life.
And what was the level of interaction you would have with the outside world? It seemed like a lot of your schooling and things like that was all done with inside the community. You have these stories you share about, going to the ice cream parlor or the, the stand on the side of the road, right? And getting an ice cream. And it's like the greatest day, like get whatever you want, right? It's like the greatest day in the world. And that's that probably a lot of experience that anybody who is outside of the community, that's a daily occurrence. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Or, this ice cream truck coming around in the summertime, right? What was your kind of dealings with the outside world? Very, very limited. And what were your views of the outside world in terms of your time within the cult?
I was dying to know everything there was to know about the outside world. And it was limited. I mean, I think I've said in my first book, I had never been in a supermarket, never been in a drugstore. I had never bought any clothing. I had never made change for a gal that ended up having a career in money. I had never even held a dollar bill when I was thrown out. I had never watched a television show. We had our own movies, which they would be brought in and they would get them from the Boston Public Library, these big, huge reels. And we would watch things like, you know, Laurel and Hardy or, or travel movies. And for me, I loved them. Most of the children would groan when they came on. And I'm thinking, no, I'm going to go see what Portugal's like. And now I'm going to see, what Turkey is all about and Japan. So for me, that was just entree into the world. But we we never went to well, we did go to churches as a child, if you remember the stories about our pilgrimages. But, I'd never ever been in a school. We were tutored, as we called it,
Yeah.
ourselves. But I did get accepted at Vassar and at Bates. And sister that ran our school, Sister Anne Mary, is the one person I thank as a mentor to me, the only woman, and it was before I was kicked out. And she obviously knew I was being kicked out, even though it was being kept a huge secret. And she would call me into one of our schoolrooms in the afternoon and just tell me, she would say things like, "You are going to do very, very well." And no one ever told me I did anything well or that I, had any any special attributes. And she would say things like, I didn't call my parents mother and dad or mummy and daddy or whatever you want. They were Sister Elizabeth Ann and Brother James Aloysius to me. And she would say, "You have the best of Sister Elizabeth Ann and Brother James Aloysius in you, and you will go far." That meant so much to me as I was terrified being tossed out at the age of 17.
Absolutely. And when you look back now, what are some of the positive experiences because like you say, I'm sure you have lifelong friends that you grew up with. What are some of the positive experiences look back and say the cult? Because it wasn't all negative. I think when you read the book, there are some positives, as well. And what are some of those positive that you would reflect back on, Patricia, at this point?
When we moved out to Still River to Harvard, Massachusetts, it was on 17 acres. And over the next couple of years, we ended up having 180 acres. And we had a farm. We built at the age of 12. I was part of a team that built a 40 by 30 stone hen house.
Wow.
And we had 300 chickens and they laid eggs, 365 days a year. I absolutely loved collecting the eggs. We had horses and ponies and we rode, but the girls, of course, had to ride side saddle, but it's fine. My youngest sister can ride side saddle bareback, which means
Wow.
no saddle, sitting sideways on a horse and galloping. There were, we would can in the summertime, canning fruits and vegetables. I just made 12 quarts of pickles. I am so addicted to canning. When people say, "What are your favorite things to do?" I love the opera. I love travel. I love this. And I love to can. And they say, "Canning? Are you sure you're being canning?" And I said, "There are vibes that I get when I start to do it. And it brings me back to my childhood in a very positive way."
That's interesting. Now, you've referenced this a couple times in our conversation, is your exit from the cult. I think this is it's an event you build up to in the books. And maybe just talk a little bit about that day, because I think that day will help people understand where you started from in
Yes.
your rise up the corporate ladder. So maybe just talk about, again, the day you got booted out and why you got booted out of the cult.
So just a little backdrop. There was one of the fathers at the center, one of the men who had 5 little boys. He asked his wife if she would leave with him, and he wanted to leave. And he said, "I'll go back to college. I'll become a lawyer, and I will make a life for us." And she said, so he was kicked out, and there was then a very large lawsuit, which is written in the annals of Massachusetts court law. And the long story short, he won the 5 boys. And so he left with the children, and then another family left. And then, you know, they realized that the authorities in Massachusetts, at the behest of this gentleman who had left, who said, "I'm not sure their education is what it should be." So he didn't even know because he wasn't a teacher, but he brought that up. So they decided, I was by then a junior in high school, and they decided that they needed to have me, I was their ammunition, apply to college to see if I could get. Bates had been where my father had gone. It's up in Maine. And they also chose Vassar, which is, of course, one of the 7 sisters and a very prestigious college. I got into both. So on that basis, the school became accredited.
Yeah.
That was
Wow.
my final act, after which Sister Catherine basically said, "I can get rid of her now." And she made me write a letter back to each of the 2 colleges saying I would not be coming. So that summer in June, we had a graduation, and it just so happened that my father, who was called one of the 3 professors from his days, after the war, was one of the speakers at my graduation. And as were the 2 other professors, because all 3 of them actually had children in the audience that were graduating that day. And I don't remember a word he said. All I remember is that I was about to be gone. Half an hour after that graduation, I went into my cubicle, changed into clothes that were worldly, a pink dress that was so not 1966, when mini skirts were starting to become the rage. And then I left. Sister Catherine never said goodbye. Father Feeney never said goodbye. And my father drove me down to Quincy, Massachusetts, where his sister and her family lived. And I stayed with them for the summer. It was actually lovely for my father because he would come down every week, and he was able to spend a lot of time with his family. And that was verboten in the organization as a whole. But as the summer came to an end, my mother came down, and she brought me down to Maryland, where her mother's family was from. And I did not even know what was going to happen in September. I had a first cousin, Paul, who was going off to St. Anselm's College in New Hampshire. And I did not know what I was going to do. And finally, my mother told me as we were driving down to Maryland that Sister Catherine had allowed that she would send me to secretarial school. And that while that was happening, I could stay at the center, not in the houses where the grown-ups lived or the children lived or the school was, but another house on the side. And I would stay there at night, and my mother would come over, whom I still thought of as Sister Elizabeth Ann, and would have dinner with me. And my father would drive me to the bus in the morning and pick me up as I drove into Boston, where the secretarial school was on Boylston Street. And I went for the first day to the secretarial school, and that was when I realized I knew nothing. Half the language they spoke made no sense to me. Words I had never heard before, swear words, slang words, people they referred to, movie stars, baseball players. I knew none of it. And I realized I had to have my eyes open, my ears open, and my mouth closed, because I could only get into trouble if I said a single word. I tell a funny story in my second book. Maybe 2 months later, but the weather was still nice. I remember that. So maybe a few weeks later, there was a word that I kept hearing everybody use. And half these words weren't in the dictionary. But this was one word that everybody used over and over and over and over again. Couldn't find it in any dictionary. There was no urban dictionary at that time. And finally, I decided I've got to ask someone what this word means. And I thought long and hard about who I would ask. And there were different kinds of girls at the secretarial school. I chose someone whom had an Irish last name, and she grew up in Arlington, a very Catholic town, and I could tell she'd been to parochial school. She was nicely mannered, and I was friendly with her, but I wasn't really friendly with anyone because I was terrified. So on a Friday afternoon, just before the going away for the weekend, I walked up to her and said, "Could you help me with something? And I hope this is okay to say on your show." And she
Absolutely.
said, "Sure." I said, "Could you tell me what the word shit means?" And she just looked at me and smiled a little bit. And she said, "Shit." And I thought, that's it. The one time I asked for help, I get nothing. And I walked out that afternoon and said, "I'm never going to open my mouth again. I'm never going to ask anyone for help. I'm just going to learn everything all on my own."
Because the concern from your side, Patricia, is you didn't want people to know about your background, right? Is that
I did
you
not.
did not want people to know the fact that you grew up in a cult. That was a secret that you were trying to protect at all costs at the end of the day. Is that fair?
It was at all costs because our cult was well known in the Boston area. And Father Feeney had for years, every Sunday, gone to the Boston Common and harangued the Jews and the Protestants and everybody and the Catholics that he didn't like. And we were called Feeniites. And it was I would rather have died than let anyone know that I was a Feeneyite.
So here's another thing I don't understand from the book is what do you think triggered your interest in investment management? If I, you talk about canning, right? As a hobby that you still like to do today. If I were to if you stopped the book after Little Sister and said, where do you think Patricia is going to end up? Where's her career? I would not have picked investment management. I would have picked, not to say that you wouldn't have rose to an executive in another field. You would have, because again, I think one of the things the cult did teach you is the value of hard work. I think if that is something that rings true in both of your books is that you worked your ass off, you know what I mean, to get where, so you would have been successful in any career that you chose. But why investment management? Was it just kind of lucky? It just kind of fell in your lap and that was kind of what you got to know? Or was there something more to it that, even in your younger days, you kind of had an interest in investment management?
In my younger days, there were two things I thought I might want to be. One was an opera star, and one was a cowgirl. So money did not play a role at all. In fact, Father Beanie would call money filthy lucre, etc. But when I was offered my first job as a receptionist, it was at a brokerage firm. And I remember thinking to myself that first morning on my new job, but the whole rest of my life in this is in the past now. I've turned over a new leaf. I was all of 19 years old, and I'm going to be the best receptionist in the entire world. I didn't even know all the things a receptionist did. And I ended as a receptionist doing a lot of things no receptionists do. I decided to be helpful, and I would offer to Xerox things, and I would fix people's telephones and fix their light bulbs and, anything to keep me energized. And little by little, I got some real responsibilities. And I had not been a year and a quarter in that position when the head the head partner called me into his office and asked me if I would be willing to fly to New York the next day and collect $5 million from five separate $1 million investors. And I wasn't even 21. And I said, yes, yes. And he said, here's a ticket to LaGuardia, and a limousine is going to pick you up in LaGuardia, and it's going to take you to all of these places. And at the end of the day, you'll fly home and bring us the $5 million. And that night, I laid out my clothes, the best, the most proper I had. And, I didn't have much of a wardrobe because I didn't have much of a budget for a wardrobe. But I went there and the limousine took me around. And at the end of the day, I brought back the $5 million. And the two partners then invited me to the Ritz-Carlton for dinner that evening. And that was my first experience in a really fancy restaurant. And I had noted everything. the white gloves of the waiters, the chandeliers, the
So cool.
food, everything. And I remember lying in bed that night and thinking to myself, I wonder ever I could ever have a job like theirs. And it was truly though step by step by step. And George Furden, who was the partner, I do call him a mentor. He wasn't a mentoring sort, but I think what he did was show me that he trusted me. And he's the one that then elevated me to becoming a secretary. And I worked then not for a broker that was selling stocks to clients, but for an analyst whom the firm had hired who did research. And he allowed me to help him with his research. And from that sparked my interest in doing research. And then I was putting myself through college at Boston University and started majoring in finance and economics. And then when my closest girlfriend told me she was moving to Philadelphia and I was heartbroken, she then quickly said, "Will you come with me?" And I said, yes. And for the next 2 years, I lived in Philadelphia and worked for 6 different analysts. They cover airlines and railroads and trucking and insurance and entertainment, and really got my stripes as a statistician and then basically a junior analyst. And then when I moved back to Boston in 1974, which was a year in which inflation was through the roof and the oil prices were through the roof and the economy was through the floor and the stock market was through the floor, I got hired as my first job as a real analyst. And I was 25 years old.
Yeah, well, there's the other thing that maybe paint a picture of as well is the role of women at that time in Wall Street. You mentioned you and your girlfriend, who was also very at that time she was very senior, like she was
Yeah.
very successful as well. Um, you were just starting out, obviously. But what was the role of women at that time? Was it kind of you and your girlfriend and that was it type of thing? Like what was the role of women in Wall Street at that point in time?
Well, there was one famous woman, but I didn't really know her till I came to New York, whose name was Mickey Siebert. And she bought herself a seat on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in the late 1960s. And there were, I think, 1,268 seats, all owned by men. 9 times she applied, and there was nobody who would support her. And eventually a bank came to her. So there were a few. They were so few and far between that they really did stick out. Susan was a trader, and I so admired her. She was 4 years older than I was. And the truth be told, when Little Sister came out, no one outside of my family members knew my story. Susan called me up and said, "What? What? How come you never told me?" I said, "Susan, I didn't know how to tell anyone the story." But she and I were immensely close, and we went to Europe together. And we were roommates together in Philadelphia. And we are immensely close to this day. In fact, I've already made my plans to visit her in Florida over the winter. Um,
Where does she end up? Where did her career path go, Patricia? Because when I think the way the book goes is that she becomes engaged or about to get married, and that is kind of the time when the two of you
oh,
kind of
well, that,
go your
that was
separate
a
ways.
wonderful, yeah, that
Yeah,
was a
and
wonderful climax for her. But no, she stayed as a trader. Ultimately, Lehman Brothers and other places. She moved
okay.
back to Boston, which was where the man lived, and they had a long, beautiful 30-year marriage. But she did retire. She is a genius bridge player.
Oh, really?
And I'm sure a lot of that comes with a trading mentality too. But no, did wonderfully, amazingly well.
And what do you think drew you to the details of looking through financials? Again, you go back to that point in time. It's interesting because now we rely on computers and all this other sort of stuff. Back then, it was a totally different environment. It was very interesting when you talked about as well in your book about the time when they eliminated when they changed their positions on trading commissions and
Oh,
what happened to some of these firms. Like again, you had mentioned one where they went weeks and months without making payroll because they couldn't deal with it anymore. But what do you think drew you into the details of going through financials and things like that? Do you think that was just kind of a hidden skill that got unlocked when you got into it?
well, the first person whose secretary I became, I worked with him. And I learned BASIC, which was a computer language. And he had a program that he, worked for our clients. And so I was able to help him. And then we had another analyst who did the airline industry. And I said to him, I see you copying numbers all the time. Will you let me do that for you? This other guy was rather reluctant, but I then asked questions and asked questions and asked questions. So, there were revenue passenger miles and available seat miles and all those, anagrams, alphabet soup of the airline industry that I memorized and, having memorized every stock symbol on the stock exchange as well. And to me, it was this thirst for knowledge, this thirst to learn. And it was very interesting because I took a lot of various economics courses and, municipal economics and environmental economics, all kinds of, and it's fine. And I thought, gosh, I'd really like to take some other courses. And so while I moved to Philadelphia and Boston University said, take any courses you want, we'll accept all of them. I went and took my first art history course. I must say it was my favorite course in the whole world. And what I learned from that course has stood the test of time. It's now at 76. I hark back to that course and it fills in so many questions that I have about art, which was really wonderful for me. But I did, learn a huge amount. I also took a political philosophy course, which what made my father very proud of me because he was a philosopher. But for me, each step of the way was an opportunity to something else. But I never planned my future. I never did. I did not know where it would go. And when I came to New York, I think that story is kind of a fun one in my book because I had been hired in 1974 up in Boston. And 6 weeks later, I found out that the firm was being acquired. And the head of the office was a wonderful man. He seemed very gruff, but he was very smart. He had been the director of research at Fidelity. And I walked into his office and said, are we being acquired? And he said, yes. And I said, does that mean last in, first out? I was the latest employee. I knew that. And he said, I'm afraid so.
At
And
least he's being honest with you.
yes, well, that just tear came down my face. I just turned 26. And I said to him, then he said to me, don't cry. You'll make me cry. This was this rough kind of guy. We were rough, but he'd a gruff voice. So I went back to my office and just sat there thinking, now what? And about an hour or so later, he came in and he said, I can't get you a job, but I can get you an interview. Tomorrow morning, be at 666 Fifth Avenue, 29th floor, blah, 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 blah. I did that. The end of that day, I was offered a job. I flew home that night, so exhilarated. I mean, the idea of living in New York was pretty exciting. And the next morning, I had to tell him. What I didn't know was that he probably already knew. He had said, I think you should interview this person. And I'm sure they called him up first thing and said, we're hiring her. At any rate, I was a little naive. And I walked in with a big smile on my face and I said, I was offered the job. And it was for like 50% more than I was making in Boston. And it was fun. But I didn't tell him anything about the money. And I said to him, but I'm in a quandary. I've just moved back to Boston, which is where my family is. And now this. And he just looked at me with his practically black eyes. And he said to me, do you want to make it big in this world? I said, yes. He said, go to New York. I knew that man for only 3 months of my life. And that was one of the most powerful mentors I ever had.
And if you're a young professional listening to this, do you think that still holds true, Patricia? If you're in the investment management business, is that go to New York if you want to make it big? Is it still true today as it was, 40 years ago when or 50 years, whenever it was when you made that same critical decision?
Yeah, well, it remains the financial capital of the world. I think we can mostly accept that. But let's look at some of the huge hedge funds that have been enormously successful that are out of Chicago. or Florida or Boston. Boston was a big. I did not want to stay in Boston because I was afraid everybody would treat me as I knew her when.
Yeah.
But New York for me was great. I've absolutely loved it. I'm glad that we raised our children, in an environment where we're in Connecticut, but near New York. It's a wonderful hub. But I dare say if you went to the University of Chicago and decided to be in Chicago, yes, but Chicago's not quite New York. And London is very powerful. A lot of people, a lot of my friends, and I spent a lot of time in Europe because I was the liaison for our Swiss and UK offices. But I just still say New York is the center of capital in the world.
And once you started to get going in the investment management world, what do you think were some of those core skills that sort of got you up to the highest levels within Wall Street? Because the thing is investment management is that, it's a gig where you can pretty easily quantify the value you're bringing to your clients. It's not like, other jobs where it's much more difficult. At the end of the day, you've got a track record that gets attached to your name based on returns and things like that. So it's a very quantitative business, which is great because they're going to evaluate you hopefully pretty objectively in terms of, your successes or your failures. What do you think were some of those core skills that kind of got you up to that next level? Because you didn't just advance up to middle manager, and then, dwindle away in Wall Street. You advanced up to the highest levels within Wall Street. So there must have been some core skills that you were able to leverage that kind of really put you up at a different level within Wall Street, much higher than, again, the average person, never mind a female at the time, the average male would, let's say, would achieve. You achieve success. It's far beyond that.
Well, I do think I had a huge drive. I am a bit of a perfectionist. Maybe too many people will say that. But in the investment world, you've got to know you have got to ferret out the information and then decide how to use it. And ferreting out the information was something I loved doing. I loved being an analyst. And when I was at Citibank, and Peter Vermillier said I wanted to become a portfolio manager, I turned him down, even though the portfolio manager was a little bit higher on the ladder, because I loved the power of being an analyst. You got to sit in a CEO's office, as though you and I were talking, and challenge them as to how they were going to achieve their growth rates, and what about this competition, and what about pricing, and what about union labor costs, and all of these kinds of things. And then you put all of that together. And back then it was on big green spreadsheets. There was no Excel spreadsheet. And you came up with your own decision, but you didn't do it by borrowing other people's work. You really had to do your own work, because the minute you borrowed someone else's, you didn't have all the answers for why you reached that decision. And so for me, I took great pride in being independent as I made my own decisions. And I was successful in that regard. And then when I did become a portfolio manager, I realized another set of skills. And it's not an unusual way of us climbing the ladder, but those skills were to know not as much, but about a large array of industries and companies. So you could then see how they fit in with each other in creating a portfolio. But I never lost the zeal for getting the facts and the details. And I think in one way that may be why I ended up earning the moniker, the Witch of Wall Street, because when I was a portfolio manager, you'll get all these phone calls in the morning after the morning meeting in which they want to read off their notes from the meeting. But to me, those notes were just notes. And I would say, but what about this? And what about this? And they would then have to go back to their analyst at the firm and say, she wants to know about this. I said, I'm happy to talk to them. Just tell them to pick up the phone and call me. That was the approach I had. And so I wasn't an easy customer. But from my standpoint, it became incredibly rewarding to learn. And my husband and I, he was in the same business. And we've often said, well, how lucky we were to be in a profession that paid you and paid you handsomely to learn every day. You don't say that about a doctor. You don't want a doctor learning on you when they're operating. So, if you make a mistake, and who doesn't? So it's a stock. It's not someone's life.
Absolutely. And how do you, you know, you talk a little bit in your book about some of the mentors and some of the people you work for having a feel for the market and when things are going to turn. How do you develop that skill of knowing when, you know, either the market is, let's say, a little bit undervalued and it's about to go up, or on the flip side, probably the riskier side is when things are overvalued and all of a sudden, you know, things are about to turn. Because you share some stories in your book about when, especially when it was overvalued, people being able to see that in advance and kind of maneuver in advance before that actually happens and kind of get out before, you know, they get hit really hard with losses and things like that.
Yes, and that is, I mean, there are different ways of managing money, and turnover can be expensive. But as the price of commissions fell, turnover becomes less and less expensive.
Yes, exactly.
And there are as many ways of looking at the market almost as there are people. But there are various schools of thought. And I found it valuable to understand the schools of thought. There's technical analysis. There's analysis on interest rates and prices and asset allocation and stuff. And then from my own standpoint, to make my determinations about what I thought might be right or wrong in a particular case, because the market is different all the time. And what works, there's nothing that works the same all the time. I mean, there's different leadership in the market. And believe me, I've had my fair share of catastrophes. And I tell a few stories in the book. But your life's career, hopefully, is not made up of, your catastrophes, made up of the great hits you have, minus the catastrophes, and you still have, a very a positive record. And it also, interestingly, I found it um, enjoyable and also stimulating to express my points of view at a conference or things like that and hear how people might challenge me because being challenged is so important as you're trying to better yourself all the time.
And and when you look at it today, I'm sure you invest a little bit for fun these days. Do you think it's easier today than it was just because there's so much more information that's readily available? Or do you actually think it's harder than it is than today? Because, you know, perhaps back when you started, you know, you actually had to work really hard to figure out a lot of those details. And you had to, you know, you were probably picking up books and reading them as opposed to today where it's a totally different environment, right? The information is a lot more readily available, a lot more people can find it. So do you think it's is it harder today than it was when you started or is it easier today? Would you want to be starting off in the investment management business today?
I think it's different today, for sure. I would absolutely encourage someone to go into the investment management business. It's always going to take a certain spirit of guts. It's always going to be risky. It's always going to have some failures, but there is a lot more information. The playing field is more level. There are really big strictures on inside information. Now there have been always, but there are fewer stocks. But then just look at the market in the last year. The leadership has been in five, six, seven stocks, and that can make you awfully uncomfortable if you don't happen to have market weights in those. So each era has its own, and I don't spend a lot of time. I do invest in stocks, but I also will invest in ETFs, and because I need risk diversification. I also invest a lot in the private markets,
Oh,
and
really?
the private markets are very, very sizable, and the number of stocks outstanding is dwindling significantly, and there aren't that many IPOs anymore. And so, I mean, that could change, of course, but a lot of companies with extra cash are buying companies that could have come to the market. And a lot of companies don't want to go public because of all the regulations. So I have found the private markets to be very interesting. Take a lot of research and a lot of homework, but there isn't the same price volatility day in and day out.
And are you surprised with some of the tech companies? Like you look at a tech company loses money and yet it trades, you know, a million times revenue or whatever it may be. Are you surprised in how perhaps the business fundamentals on some of these businesses have really changed over time?
I am very impressed by the vision that people have. NVIDIA, I've watched it and watched it. I've
Yeah.
never owned it. I do own it because it's in the S&P 500. But it's fascinating to see people's vision and to see it come true. And I admire people like that. But those are people who are analysts who study what's going on. And, I was never a technology analyst. I always loved talking to our technology analysts because they were in the periphery, you know, the ionosphere of what was going on on Earth. And that's where a lot of things were happening. But today with AI, for example, it's really fascinating to see how many industries that are just standard industries, manufacturing or pharmaceutical companies will benefit from AI and how it will increase productivity. And that will be good for the market as a whole. And it will also mean that we can get jobs. We won't be running out of people because there'll always be jobs.
Well, and I think, you would have a perspective on this, on how quick technology changes. You look at the lot of the large tech companies that, let's say, existed in the '80s and '90s, they don't
And
exist
the
anymore.
60s.
Yeah, like they're gone, right? They don't, they get lapped. And you wonder again, those large tech companies today, whether, Apple and Microsoft and Google and these companies, will we still be talking about them in 20 years? What do you think?
Well, I think some we will and some you won't. I
Yeah.
remember digital equipment back in the 1960s, and the head of the guy, they were headquartered up in the Boston area, and he said nobody will ever have a computer on their desk. And his belief sank the company ultimately. So, I think that the technologies change, they change faster than ever. But you know what's fascinating? It used to be when I was an analyst, you had to pay attention to currencies because there was a Deutschmark and there was a French franc and there was an Italian lira and there was a Swiss franc and all had different interest rates and all had different, all those impacts on the bottom line of a multinational company. Today, there's the euro and it's frankly pretty stable with the dollar.
Yeah.
So, the challenges come and the challenges go.
So the other thing that's unique with your career path is you left Wall Street at a fairly young
I
age. You
did
didn't stick around until, like you mentioned, Warren Buffett earlier. '80s or I'm not sure if he's over 90 now, but
years.
he'll be there until till the end, presumably, right? You took a totally different career path in terms of you chose to exit Wall Street a lot earlier, which again you have to respect. And part of that obviously due to a personal situation with your kids. You had kids at a later time in life than most, but maybe just talk about that decision because I can imagine you're in the prime of your career. You know what I mean? Like you're in the prime of your career and you decide to step away and maybe just talk a little bit about that decision.
Sure. And I don't say that my model is the right model. There is no right model when it comes to your career and your family life. It happened to be what I did. I was late as a mother, particularly in the 1990s. I mean, I was 45 years old when I gave birth to my twins. Very healthy, large, everything was great. And I told myself when I was on my maternity leave, okay, stop climbing the corporate ladder. And I meant it because I was so enthralled and so, you know, over the moon in a way to be a mother finally, having tried for a long time. And yes, you could have all the arguments. Why didn't you do it when you were 30? And, the
Well, and
life,
Patricia, I just want to stop you there because the story you have in your book about when you found out that you were pregnant
yes,
is again like stranger than fiction. Like it is. That is a that story certainly makes you think about whether there is something else going on in this world. The story of going to see a psychic and finding out that is a fascinating story that is in that personal side in your book. I love that story.
oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm having dinner tonight with the woman who gave me that birthday present. So I did my best to slow down. And then little by little, and we were very fortunate. We had a nanny at home. But little by little, opportunities would come along. And by the time my children were born in 94, by 1999, they were 5 years old and they were about to head into real school, no, kindergarten. And we were out up at the beach in Rhode Island. And I was on the conference calls. And my husband came home that day with children. They'd just been out in the ocean all day. And he said, we're having a fabulous time. The children are swimming in the ocean and you are on the phone. This is not a vacation for you. And I realized that. And that night I lay in bed truly and thought about it. And the next morning when I woke up, I said to him, it was Labor Day weekend. I said, when we go into the city on Tuesday, I am going to retire. I didn't say quit. I wasn't going to look for another job. And I just said, it's time for me to be with my children. I really, really did want to be the one to answer questions when they were 5 and 6 years old. And so I announced that I was leaving. I gave them 4 months till the end of December and went around to all the European and Far East offices where I had worked with so closely with so many people. And on December 31st, 1999, it was my last day on Wall Street. And I've been doing a lot of TV work on Squawk Box and places like that, CNN as well, and folks. And I continue to do that because the one thing I was trying to think about what I would do. I was not going to just can all day or knit sweaters all day. I really needed intellectual stimulation. And so I kept going on the air and they just knew I was not with, Invesco anymore. And that was the door that led to another career. When someone saw me and said, I think you would make a great expert witness. I barely knew what an expert witness was. I knew what the terms meant, but I didn't know how it applied to the investment industry. And in a way, that was so fortuitous because when you're an expert witness, you do 80% of the work in your own house. You're reading, you're engaging in, conference calls, all of which could be done while the children were at school. And, I picked them up. But it was hugely stimulating to me. And it's why I actually tell the story, which I won't tell you because I think I don't want to tell all the fun stories of that my first big lawsuit in Florida in like 2003 or 4. And it took that many years to prepare for it. It was just a huge, huge case and winning it. And not that I did it all on my own. I mean, the lawyers were brilliant and there were other experts as well. And that started another career. But that second career of expert witness that also went into board work was one in where I really did control my time. It'd
Yeah.
take a block of 2 or 3 days to go for a board meeting. And then you come back and you've got a couple of weeks of time where you don't have to be, studying or anything like that. And I found it so intellectually rewarding. It really, really was. I felt so lucky that I ended up with a second career.
And talking about funny stories, you mentioned Squawk Box. There's a good story in the book as well about sneaking out of the house at 5:30 a.m. or whatever it was, and going on TV. A couple hours later, and not necessarily being in the best of shape to show up on television as well. Take a read of the book, and you'll get a few chuckles out of that. So that's a great. Makes you think, Patricia. Now, as you watch it today, what's the backstory for all the people who are on that show? What happened to them? 2 hours before they came on air. That's what I think about now after reading after reading that story. But did that decision to leave, I can imagine that it was tough. Like, was it a difficult transition to get out again? You're kind of going a million miles an hour in Wall Street, being this leader that everybody looks up to. And, any big issue, it's like, we got to get Patricia on the phone to then being a mother. You know what I mean? Like, and a stay at home mom effectively, right? Like that has got to be a difficult transition. How was that transition?
I really, really loved it. I loved taking them to school every day. Right through their last year of high school, I really reveled in the fact that I knew my children could say that they had breakfast made for them at home every day. There was no running to Dunkin' Donuts and grabbing, a donut or coffee or something. I wanted to make scrambled eggs and I wanted to make pancakes. But that wasn't my whole day. Once they were in school, my day was very much involved, but I also started giving back to the community. I did a lot of pro bono work in my town. And that also is inspiring because inevitably I'd be on a finance committee. Inevitably, I'd become the treasurer of the organization. So you're just doing it in a different way. It's not as competitive, but there are pressures. But to me, there's nothing worse than being idle. And sometimes I think I do it to a fault these days. Sometimes if I really want to read something, I think to myself, well, you're wasting time. And I shouldn't. I should just, be happy. A good book will keep me. But other times it's like a silly article in a fashion magazine. And I'm suddenly thinking, you're just wasting your time reading this. And I thought, no, it's okay. Do it, do it, do it.
And did any of your siblings follow in your career path? Like when your parents look as well upon your on your career path, were they surprised? And did any of your siblings follow your career path, or were you kind of the lone one that kind of went out and did this, and kind of the other siblings didn't follow the same path? Where'd your siblings end up?
They certainly didn't end up in the world of finance. But my sister Kathy left the center. So my parents left in 1969, which was 3 years after I had left. And all of this happened after Sister Catherine died. She died 2 years after she kicked me out. And the whole place started to fall, which tells you more about a cult leader and that there's no glue that holds the place together. And in 1971, my sister Kathy left. And she was a nun up at the center. And I remember the day she came home because my father and I were up there. It was around Easter time. And my father said, I think she needs a little vacation. I'd like to take her home. And the woman that was running the place then, actually a woman much nicer than Sister Catherine, said, sure. And I remember I was living in my own apartment in Cambridge at that point. And I remember watching my sister Kathy from behind. She was still in her nun's clothes and she was making dinner for all of us. And she was singing to herself. And I was sitting behind her at a kitchen table, just looking at her I said to myself, she's never going back. And she never did. But she told me that she always felt the calling to be a nurse. And
Interesting.
this was my parents were living in Cambridge. And I said, well, there's a hospital right down the street here, Mount Auburn Hospital, and they have a nursing school. Let's go together. And we did. And she applied and she got in and she aced it. And she had an entire career as a nurse, a career I could not have handled. I, to this day, wouldn't, I know that I could not have done that, but she did and she loved it. So in each in their own way, they did their own careers, but none of them ended up being a Wall Street kind of career. And partially because I was so alone, I had to really break out on my own and used the people that were around me as mentors to kind of help channel me. The man, George Burton was just phenomenal, allowing me to do things. And I'm going, wow, that was fun. I enjoyed that. And then working very closely with a guy who gave me as much rope as I wanted. And then going to Philadelphia and having all those people. And by then I was just totally ensconced in it. And it was Greek to my whole family, but I loved it.
And when you look back, Patricia, would you change anything? It's easy to say, "Oh man, I wish I didn't grow up in a cult," but that may have changed fundamentally your personality. You can't necessarily take one string out of the ball because the whole ball falls apart. You know what I mean? When you start doing that, and I'm just wondering when you look back at your childhood and your subsequent career and things like that, would you change anything, or would you say, you know what, like if I change anything, it's going to change who I am today, and therefore I wouldn't change a thing? Where do you land on that?
I land squarely on, of course, I wish I'd have more time with my parents, but that's gone. There's no one who's crying over spilled milk. I would not change anything because just as you said, how do I know what the path of my life would have been if I grew up in an entirely different way? I had to learn to be incredibly disciplined. Maybe my instincts would have been to be less disciplined. I think there's a certain amount of DNA in you that maybe makes you hone a particular set of characteristics. But I never said, I wish this had never happened. And the interesting thing is, in my second book, I spent much more sophisticated time thinking about my childhood and the impact it had on me. And in a very interesting way, Sister Catherine, who never wished me good luck or anything as she kicked me out, was, I think, subliminally a role model. Maybe, yeah, it was definitely subliminal. She was not a mentor. There are no such things as bad mentors. They're either a mentor or they're not. But she was a role model. And I think people have asked me, aren't you ever fearful? Weren't you ever fearful when, a particular position you were given or a particular task that you might fail at it? And, or that, this is an arena full of men and you're the only woman. And I never did. And I think it's because the role model I had from the time I could remember till 17 when she kicked me out was that a woman ran everything.
Yeah.
Not one man ever pushed back on her. She got her way. And so there was never any fear that I couldn't do something because I was a woman. And
You know,
that
the other
remains with me today.
the other thing that stuck out for me, Patricia, in your book is, would you have had that same zest to travel and experience all the world as much as you did without, because you kind of, your first part of your life again was very sheltered. And it was
Sure.
kind of like saying, look, I want to go out and experience. And then the second you get out there, it's not just I'm gonna dip my toe in the water. It is like I wanna do everything that I almost couldn't do when I was a kid growing up. Because that was the other thing that kind of surprised me is it wasn't like you were living this sheltered life when you got out. It was the opposite. It was, I wanna experience, we wanna go to Haiti, let's go to Haiti. We wanna go to, the communist bloc, let's go to the communist bloc. It was whatever crazy thing somebody wanted to do, Patricia was first in line.
You are right. But I credit the lives of the saints, the stories of the lives of the saints, and my geography classes, because there was the world. And I was aching to do it. So when we were children and we read about St. Francis of Assisi, and, it was in Umbria and Tuscany. And the way it was described was the rolling hills of Tuscany. I just wanted to see those rolling hills of Tuscany. I wanted to see the cedars of Lebanon. I wanted to see the Mediterranean Sea. And so there was no limit to the number of places I wanted to go to. And by then, flying was, I remember flying to Australia and back in 1972. And oh my God, it took forever, but I didn't have the best 3 weeks. So, yeah, I think the travel bond, but very interestingly, after my parents left, for 40 years they were together. And honestly, they would go to Europe every single year.
Yeah.
So I think there was a little genetic bug in me that wanted to travel.
No, it's a great story. The way I'll wrap up, any next book in line, Patricia? Is there any of your story that's untold? Is there any thought to, you can imagine, a movie about, a woman that grows up in a cult rising to the highest levels of Wall Street. That, I can imagine, it's the book taking a bit of a movie or a Hollywood element. Is there any next book or perhaps next project in the hopper? What can we expect from
Well, there
Patricia?
are some projects in the hopper along the lines of what you're talking about, but very interestingly, I do have another book in mind,
Oh,
and
really?
it's not so much, it's not going to be anything like the first two. It's much more going to be a series of essays. And the title of the book I already have, I could be changed, but is Conversions. And for me, I was shaped by my upbringing and then changed in a way when I got into the world, and shaped and changed and shaped and changed. And so many things that come to me now at this stage in my life where I realize I thought adamantly this was the way things were until I had an experience, or until I asked a question, even at the age of 7 or 8, until I tried to enlighten myself more about it and came to realize that it was a different point of view. How there was a different outcome. And it's happened so many times. And I think now I've learned so much from it that I'm a kind of converted woman.
It makes it's that curiosity, right?
Yes.
It's that thirst for knowledge to, either if you have a thesis, either prove the thesis or disprove the thesis. You're fine either way. Just show me the data that gets me there. And if you're wrong, you're wrong. And
That's right.
off you go.
Yes.
So no, it's I would look forward to reading those essays for sure.
But I'm gonna
Well,
keep playing with this book and then, like slowly. But I think so often I start jotting notes down. So I have another folder on my computer that's just
Well, it'd be
called
interesting as well, even just to hear your thoughts on how the investment world has changed over the years. I think you have
yes.
such a perspective on how, and you get that from the book about how things have really changed over the last 30 years in the investment world. I think people would be well to remember some of the things that you again bring up in your book, where again things were a lot different, and how tough times can come, and
Yeah.
and how they can be very 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 difficult. Because I'm
Well,
not sure
what
if we've
that
had
story you
that.
told about the firm that couldn't pay its employees.
Well,
I was the
their
employee.
business was taken out from them, right? Like their business was legislated away from them effectively, right?
That's
There was
right.
nothing they could do.
And that was my first job in New York. And by June, I had no income.
Oh,
And
no,
it was frightening.
yeah, that would be absolutely frightening. Yeah. Well, Patricia, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a very, very fun chat. I would highly recommend both books. They're both terrific. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us. We really
Thank
appreciate
you.
you
I'll
taking the
let you
time.
know that if I have a website
Okay. Yeah.
and I write a blog, and I just wrote one literally a couple of days ago about the Fed and interest rates next week. But
Okay.
my blog, my website is just patriciachadwick.com. And so there will be ways of buying the books, mostly right through to Amazon or Barnes and Noble or something like that. But then there are also other things and interviews and things like that, which I'm hoping that this interview might be on there one of these days too.
And you can find Patricia the same way. I think I can't remember exactly how I came across your name, but you can find her on LinkedIn as well. And a lot of the information on how to learn more about Patricia is all on LinkedIn. So send her a connection request. I'm sure she'd be happy to respond, and you'll learn a lot. Again, it's a your story is very unique, and it's inspiring. It is absolutely inspiring.
Thank you.
So yeah.
Thank you, Scott, for having me. I really appreciate it and for reaching out to me.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.